This is the Westminster Standard Podcast. I'm Ryan Beasy. Today we are joined by an all-star panel of moderators, chairman, and Bob Mattes. Thanks for being part of the program. We have Josh Walker, the moderator of Arizona Presbytery, Fred Greco, former moderator of the General Assembly, Steve Tipton, last year's Overtures chairman, Mel Duncan, this year's Overtures chairman, Steve Dowling, last year's moderator, Bob Mattes, keeping us straight at the mics. And I'm Ryan Beasy, the least qualified person on this call. Thanks, everyone, for being here. So what are your perceptions about this year's General Assembly? Did we succeed in what we set out to do?
You know, Ryan, I think about this assembly the same way I think about the PCA. I'm very bullish on the PCA. We're healthy. We're growing steadily. And in a sense, that's boring. Right. In my days of lawyering for startup businesses, I always said what you wanted was the boring counting of money in order to succeed. Mm-hmm. I think that's where we are. And this assembly, really didn't have a lot of the incredible controversies that we've had in the past. Yeah. And I think that's good. We had some things where some men got excited and we had some lengthy debates, but nothing like 5 years ago or even more, 10 or 15 years ago. I was very pleased with the debate and very pleased with what went on, even if there weren't a lot of, sound bites for the social media world to go crazy over.
It was hard to put together a highlight reel this year. I'm so thankful for the hot mic with Bob Mattes.
Yeah, well, speaking of hot mics, I think I was encouraged partly because we're still above 30%. For ruling elder participation. I'd like to see more. And then so we're working towards that. But the other thing I was heartened by, and I said the same thing last year, is I didn't really talk that much to the issues this year. And I did last year. And large part of that is because the younger people are stepping up to the mic and making extremely good arguments. They're the future of the PCA, like Fred says, the future's bright. And I think we're headed in a good direction. I don't know how deep we're going to get into it, but I had a discussion right before the assembly with somebody, and they pointed out what they thought was the turning point in all this. And I think that was the homosexuality amongst teaching elders. That really woke people up, I think. And I think we're still seeing the benefit of that.
Yeah. Mel, what are we to make of the higher turnout at General Assembly? You give the thanks report almost every year, and certainly almost every year that I've been attending. So you get to see what it's like at the end. Do you think these higher turnouts will continue?
I think for a while they will. I think folks are motivated and engaged. I was thinking today, amongst denominations, the PCA surely has the best grassroots podcastery that's out there. And there are lots of ways to plug in and to get informed. And I think for regular old folks who are trying to learn about the PCA, places like here that you provide, Ryan, are good ways for people to do that. I think it helps when GAs are in the Southeast. I know we're about to make our foray into Louisville and then beyond there to Milwaukee, but I think for the time being, I think Louisville will be a good attended assembly. My analogy for GAs is kind of like the Thanksgiving family meal. And you want to make sure everybody has a place at the table. Everybody has an opportunity to say what they want to say. You want to have a very clear plan that you execute, a start time and end time. And you want everybody to eat well and to feel like family. And I think we did that this year.
And you want to make sure your crazy uncle has two stout nephews sitting on either side.
To make sure the nephews are vigilant and are watching the crazy uncle for sure.
Speaking of which, how are things in Arizona?
Arizona's doing wonderful.
Good. Steve, you work for are you still doing work for the AC advising, or are you strictly CCB and SJC now?
I don't work for the AC anymore. I was elected this summer up to SJC, and I will be resigning from CCD soon. Just so that there's not a huge conflict of interest beyond obviously CCD reviews the minutes of the SJC. But I don't, as my wife tells me, I don't have to be on every committee. So I'm gonna choose not to be on CCB anymore. So.
Mm. And speaking of locations, did I hear that we're going to be in Milwaukee in 2 years?
Correct. Yeah.
That's a long way away. One of the things that struck me, and maybe I heard it wrong, but it sounds like they not only pick locations for economic factors, but ways that we can extend the profile of the PCA. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's
Go ahead, brother.
no. Go ahead, Steve. I'll follow up.
Well,
Steve, you know a thing or two about business. Why don't you speak to that?
Well, I mean, I do love it. I do. I know it's inconvenient, but every place we go is inconvenient for somebody. And if we're in this together, I think it really is helpful to go to other people's homes.
Mm.
I know that we could argue, well, we're a little weaker in the West than we are in the Southeast. That's inarguably true. But maybe we get a little stronger by showing up and waving the flag a little bit. I'm anxious to go to Milwaukee, to be honest with you. I went back to Michigan, to where I grew up, for the first time in 50 years for my high school reunion this past year. I couldn't believe it. The place is beautiful. Money's been poured in. A lot of great things are happening up there, and I'm kind of anxious to see what's happened in Milwaukee. So I like the idea of moving it around first as a general statement, but then I also like the specific locations that have been picked. And I absolutely love Chattanooga. And not just because it's close. I think it's a great little city. So I like the idea of location.
I'm biased toward Chattanooga, although I think we had a smaller assembly hall than we have recently. There were only 6 microphones, not 8, which made it slightly more difficult for me to get to one, which may be a good thing.
Well, I read something by the host committee. I was just going to finish the comment with, I read something by the host committee chair, I believe, on that, and he said he thinks it's the last time that we'll be able to fit into Chattanooga. So it may have been a swan song for those reasons that you're mentioning, Ryan.
Because people like to have me at the mic, I guess. Speaking of speaking too much, our stated clerk, our interim stated clerk, did he say 50 words this assembly? What a gift he is to the PCA. I know, I've clerked for all of 11 months. And it seems like the more work I do on the front end, the less I have to say because the moderator's prepared. So John Baez must have been pulling 22-hour days to get ready because I don't think he said much at all. What do y'all think? How did he do?
Ryan, if you don't like John Bice, there's something wrong with you.
Yeah.
That wasn't intended as a criticism.
No, I'm just saying in general for anyone. John is one of the finest men I have ever met. I count him as a very dear friend. And I got to spend the weekend with him and some other folks, including Steve, before assembly. And we all need to know this. John doesn't need this job. John wasn't angling for this. He's got plenty of work to do. He's semi-retired. He doesn't need to be doing this. He's doing it for his love for the church. And he, on almost no notice, prepped for this assembly. And one of the reasons it ran so smoothly is because of John's work.
Yeah.
I have to agree.
And the AC staff, but
yes,
absolutely, yeah.
I would like to add with John, and I hope this isn't over spiritualizing the situation, but I felt like God made him for this moment. God wasn't surprised by anything that happened here.
Right.
If you look back at the history of John Bice and the things that would have caused perhaps another man to go, okay, I'm going to step to the side. John ran for moderator 3 times, was defeated twice before he was moderator. One of those defeats led to him actually being called to the microphone by the sitting moderator to help us through an extraordinarily difficult time, which I thought was wonderful, both from a message of humility on the part of the moderator and an example of love for the church that Fred just mentioned on the part of John. And then in a subsequent year, the man who beat him the prior year actually nominated John to be the moderator. And you just see these kind of extraordinary things where John Bice just keeps staying the course because his level of commitment is unflappable. His love for the Lord is completely constant, and he will do anything for the bride of Christ. And so I couldn't agree more with Fred. But, for me, it really has a profound spiritual component, too, because John's at a stage in life where he could just be stepping aside for everything, and he isn't.
Yeah, I thought he really served us well. Mel, you've clerked for a little bit longer than I have of a presbytery. Has that been your experience? That the harder you work, the less you have to
Yeah,
say.
that's right. I mean, I like to say somebody's got to work an hour for every presbytery minute. And, that's the committee chairman, that's the people bringing reports. But yeah, John is fantastic. And the AC staff also bears a lot of praise as well. They had to
Mhm.
plug in a lot of holes, and everybody, pulled their own weight a little bit more this past week. And
Yeah.
PCA was well served in Chattanooga. It was a great event.
I tell you that AC staff, Heidi Harrison. I had a question from a pastor in our presbytery, and he emailed me, and I said to him, It's like 8:50 now. I think before 9 a.m. Heidi Harrison is going to have the answer for us, and she did. She did. So we've got some great people working there in Lawrenceville and working to save money on the assembly. Was it Angela Nance who, really tries to bring those AC costs down? I know I voted against the increase, and someone on this podcast, his pastor, chastised me for that, but we won't hold that against him. But they really work hard to keep costs low.
And well, I'm glad for the shout out for Angela, Ryan. She is an absolute treasure for the PCA. And for years and years, she's done unbelievably competent work. I don't know what we're paying her, but it's not enough. She's outstanding.
It's good.
And the other thing I was going to say about John is he delegated well, right? Because the commissioner briefings and everything, he gave those to Fred.
Yep.
And that allowed him to step out and do the other things he needed to do before the assembly itself. So, I mean, he had good people to turn to, and he was willing to do that rather than just, be the star of the show. And I thought that was really good. And Fred did a really great job too. Not too surprising, but
Bob, you're just trying to pick a fight because Howie and I did them too. But you're building up Fred. I'm not sure what's going on there, but I want to register my complaint.
Ryan, you better get the temperate order ready.
Speaking of which, how about our moderator? Didn't he do a great job?
Yeah, he was great. He was great. Kevin is. I think everybody knew Kevin would be good, but he was genuinely great. And it was a complex assembly. There were some things personnel wise and structural wise that created some debate.
And some guy wanted to call 5 questions when there was only 1 question before us.
Yep. And he was prepared and he did a great job. Kevin was great.
Yeah, there were many of us who thought that we might even go into Friday going into GA with all the business that we had in front of us. And we got done very expeditiously. And I think in a large part due to his leadership, he did a phenomenal job.
Yeah, I assumed, like as Mel said, I assumed he has 70 elders on his session, so he knows how to moderate a large meeting. He did great. I was at a loss for words. Well, there was one controversy, and I think it's largely from people who were A, not at the meeting, and B, live in Moscow, Idaho. But there was some online folks, especially those who like to use anonymous Twitter handles, who have criticized the way one of the speeches was handled. Steve, you're something of a parliamentary expert. Steve Tipton, well, as was Steve Dowling. This is difficult.
No, it's not. I knew who you were referring to when you said the parliamentary expert. It's the other one. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I agree with you.
But so can you walk us through the Timothy Brindle had 65 seconds left on the clock, and there was some booing and hissing and points of order, and the moderator gave a very gentle reminder of decorum. Can you walk us through what happened there, Steve Tipton?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you kind of did a good job already. Brenda was at the microphone, was speaking to the issue of the recommendation from MNA about, actually, it was kind of an odd recommendation. It was sort of a complex thing where they were asking us both to make statements about Dr. Ince and elect him. And so that was odd. Usually there's just a recommendation to elect, and then maybe there's another added recommendation by the committee commissioners to commend or something like that. But this was a little odd to begin with. And there was a lot of discussion about, a variety of issues. Again, Teaching Elder Brindle came to the microphone and was raising issues that other men had not raised that he thought were important. I think he was doing a very good job. I've heard him before. Not all of us can speak without passion. If some of us are able to do that even if we're passionate about an issue. Teaching Elder Brindle seems like the kind of guy who has sort of one way of speaking, regardless of what's going on, and that was passionate about it. And there's nothing wrong with that; it's commendable. And at one point, he bled into what appeared, at least to the moderator, ultimately, what matters, and then a number of people on the floor, that he was speculating about the character of Dr. Ince, rather than speaking to the issue of the motion. And as has been made mention by others, the issue with Robert's rules is there's a motion on the floor, and your comments need to be addressed about the motion, not about persons, and certainly not about motivations. And especially if you go back and listen to it, I don't need to repeat it, but I think part of the issue is that Teaching Elder Brindle was sort of speculating about what Dr. Ince might feel or might not feel with respect to himself or people like him, if I could say that judiciously enough. And that certainly went beyond Robert's Rules levels of decorum. There were a number of people, again, who were booing and hissing, which happens occasionally. It should never happen. That was also a breach of decorum. But there were some men who were trying to make points of order, no doubt with respect to what Kevin DeYoung ultimately addressed, which was the lack of decorum. I think that, again, I don't want to say that this was super intentional. Sometimes, God's hand in providence just works in miraculous ways, and we say the right thing at the right time. And even if we don't remember why we did that or why we would have said it, because he didn't even call upon anyone to make a point of order, which if he had, he might have had to basically call him down and even move on to another microphone. He just wisely in the moment gave him an admonition, maybe that's a warning, to remember our rules of decorum and to speak in that way. The only thing that was unfortunate about it, the whole issue, in my opinion, was the fact that our timekeeper, who otherwise did an amazing job all assembly, there were only a few instances out of 3 days where the timekeeper wasn't quite paying close attention, unfortunately. He didn't stop the clock, and it had been stopped on every other point of order, every other discussion, and so Teaching Elder Brindle was robbed of an opportunity to continue to speak. It would have been maybe 17 seconds, I think, at that point was all that was left. But that's a small thing in the context of the whole assembly. I thought Kevin DeYoung did a very wise thing, a very capable thing, in not addressing it as a violation of order, but simply giving a warning and then moving on. So.
Yeah, he really did.
I mean,
I think it's important for people to know that being moderator is very difficult. So Steve knows this. And it's much more difficult, in my opinion, to moderate the General Assembly than a presbytery or a session meeting, even a large meeting. And here's why. You've got a lot of arcane and unusual rules, and you have helpers. And as Steve knows, when the helpers have different opinions, you have a cacophony of noise behind you. It's not like they're passing you a paper saying, rule this way. You've got one guy saying one thing and another guy saying another thing. And then you've got from the floor people shouting different things. And so Kevin handled it so well. He really didn't even rule. All he did was just say, okay, let's move along and let's try to move along well with decorum. And the folks who've never done this, whose entire experience in ecclesiastical courts is watching a live stream and playing anonymous on Twitter, somehow second guessed him. When they don't know our rules, they haven't moderated or led anything. and they certainly haven't done it with anything as large as the General Assembly. And so it's kind of like if someone who's never preached says, well, preacher, I think you could preach better by doing this, or you ought to study that. Yeah. Or even the ruling elders, you ought to do this in a budget meeting. I've never looked at a budget and I don't know anything about money, but I think you ought to do that. So, what Kevin did was actually the mildest thing that could have possibly been done. I had, in God's providence, the opportunity to chat with Teaching Elder Brindle in the elevator of the hotel afterwards. He was not upset by what happened. It's actually interesting that he was amongst the least upset or affected people, it seems like, in the universe. Yeah. He didn't ask for more time. He didn't ask for an apology. He understood what was going on and just, went on. And so this is, I think, an instance of people who are outside the PCA just basically trying to poke trouble. And I think it's folks who don't like some of the very good work that Kevin's done as an author in the past, trying to make him look bad, which they couldn't do because he was fabulous. Right.
And he didn't say that Brindle was intemperate. He said, speak in a more temperate way, which by definition means that he was temperate. So it was a helpful interjection.
Yeah, Ryan, I don't want to go past
I would also
the point
say
the other Steve made either, because Fred's 100% right in everything he said. It's very, very difficult. But there was kind of a mixture of God's providence and brilliance in that, because to sustain that point of order would have necessitated, just out of conscience, Kevin rebuking the assembly. That booing and all of that was atrocious. I mean, I don't remember that happening in the past. I'm sure it must have, but I don't recall it. And I don't want to see us head in that direction. And the way he handled everything else, I think for him to have done one would have necessitated the other. So all in all, the beating he took over that, to me, I'm with the other brothers. I just think it's nonsense. But also what he did do was quite brilliant. Or what
there are some online who are suggesting that he did this out of an ideological motivation, that he was somehow opposed to what was being said. And I would just point out for those who are listening that if you go back the night before, there was another speech given by Brother Brindle. On a similar topic with as much passion and as much fervor, and it was gone over without any interruptions from anybody on it. So to suggest that this was somehow ideologically motivated by our moderator just doesn't hold any water in the online discourse.
And anyway, there were things that perhaps should have given rise to a point of order. But all in all, I think it's instructive for the assembly to recognize that was a pretty nuanced interaction, and that we all should learn from it so that we can just do better together next time.
And to follow up on the idea that these are people that not our circus, not our monkeys, is that part of the argument out of Moscow is that, well, there's more important things than the rules of order, and PCA spends too much time in parliamentary procedure, and considering the source, I mean, that parliamentary procedure is obviously made to make gatherings like this work. I mean, it'd look like the English Parliament if we didn't do it this way. And so I think he did a great thing. Personally, I agree with Brindle's point, but he clearly went over the line. And I think Kevin, Steve said, he did about the least that he could do in the overall scheme of things to be respectful to the brother and his point. So I think, it's not our circus, not our monkeys. Just let them play on their own little sandbox and ignore them. I'm not sure why anybody listens to those people anyway, but that's another story. Well,
and the Robert's Rules, that's something of good and necessary consequence that are drawn from literally human societies and their interactions. We have to have order. We have to decide who gets to speak and for how long. I think Steve Tipton, you've used the illustration on maybe Polity Matters podcast of is it drawn from Mount Sinai that you get 60 days to file a complaint? No, but that's a good and necessary. You got to have a cutoff somewhere, and 60 days is as good as any, except maybe 59. So I've got some things that I'm going to change in our presbytery minutes, but I'm not going to, if I don't get a complaint. If I get a complaint about something, I'm going to leave it in there. But a motion failed, and but I've got to wait 60 days before I take out all those extra details just in case somebody wants to complain, which they've got 5 more days to do. So there we are. But yeah, I thought our moderator did a superb job, but he did get a little bit of help from a few people, 3 of whom at least are on this panel. So whose point of order was most helpful? That of Tipton, Mattes, or Greco?
Well, I feel obligated to say that Fred opened the door correctly, and his and mine were parallel to each other. I mean, his mine followed up his observation that we were using the wrong part of the RAO, and then I told them what part of the RAO they should be using. So I think those two are in parallel. So I don't think one was better than the other. They were cooperative and affirming.
No, gang it up on Steve. I see how this works. Well, obviously now I think the Tipton one was best.
I don't remember what mine was.
I don't either. That was a principled intervention, Steve.
Well, I will say that my point of order came with a veiled threat, which I think brought about the funniest line of the assembly from Kevin.
I agree.
Et tu, Fred was pretty good.
Et tu, Fred.
That was pretty good.
Good.
He had to have that ready in his back pocket. There's no way he came up with that on the spot. That was too good. If he did that on the spot, my hat's off.
Well, he'd have to have predicted that I would make a point of order, though, wouldn't he?
That never
happened. Safe assumption.
Never
That's a pretty safe assumption.
That's that sarcasm thing I've heard about.
But not only did we have, go ahead.
Well, and I was just going to say, I mean, I think one of the benefits of this assembly is, first of all, just going back to the moderator, he did an amazing job. He was surrounded by very capable people who were helping in a relatively unobtrusive way. I mean, we do now have that one picture of everybody holding up Robert's rules and pairs down there, and we have it even in Norman Rockefeller style that we can get printed up and put somewhere in the AC building. But even with a few exceptions, the attempts to help, we didn't have a lot of that this year either. Where, as Fred has said on many occasions, if you have a motion and you think it's going to help us, just don't, just stop, just sit down. There were a few of those, but not nearly as those in the past. And just moving through business expeditiously. Not to infringe on anybody's rights to speak on the matter, at least within the time limits that we have. But we set 10 minutes. We're going to give 10 minutes, and if nobody wants to continue, we're going to move on. And we did that. And there were not a lot of extraneous things going on during the meeting, which was very helpful as well.
To illustrate that point, in the Overtures Committee, I got up on the first day to make a motion to amend our dear former moderator's suggested schedule, and it passed and it moved an item back. By the time we got to talking about it, we spent about 15 minutes arguing about why we don't move this back to where it was, and then we did, and we lost time. So I will take that advice and heed it for the rest of my life. That don't try to make motions that help us with time.
Listen to Fred.
Well, in addition to the help from some points of order, I think our moderator had some great help from our Overtures chairman, who had a superb schedule. Mel, how many hours did you put into not only the way you would present these to the floor, but just preparing for the Overtures Committee meeting to get that meeting done by Monday night?
Yeah, I mean,
Tuesday afternoon.
The month of June was just sort of getting ready for Overtures and trying to have conversations with folks. Howie and Fred and others are invaluable to the work of Overtures Committee, particularly the way they suggested that we sequence the debate. And it was really brilliant. We had 37 items before our committee. I was so pleased at the end of our work, 30 of the 37 had something like 85% majorities. And that was because the room worked well with one another. It takes a couple hours to kind of get a feel for that, but there was good back and forth and good debate there. I thought it was, we just had some extraordinary people on the committee. We had some good arguments, and the Overtures Committee, people have referred to it. It's kind of the assembly within the assembly, and so it's more deliberative. It's more direct. It's a little bit more freewheeling. It was interesting. There's always BCO things. There's always rules of discipline things. There were a few form of government items this sequence. And then this year we had the discussion about the directory for worship. There also were some interesting things outside of the book, some culture things. The Bitcoin thing was both, crazy and yet fascinating at the same time. We had the immigrant item that provoked some spirit on the floor of GA. That was not exactly the way I remember it in the committee, but it was good. I was glad the Area 51 overture that everybody talked about didn't make it up. I was worried I was going to have to speak on extraterrestrials on the floor of General Assembly, and while my children would have loved that, I'm not sure I would have been comfortable with that. But honestly, it was a great experience. This was my 7th time to be in that room for that committee, and I've watched it. AC staff was fantastic. Of course, Sam is a parliamentarian, and Pear was in there to help. Scott Edberg and Eddie Lim were invaluable. It was a great experience. I'm happy to break down some of those. Bob did a great job right as we began by clearing out the low-hanging fruit. I had a more complex version of Bob's motion ready, but it was good. I mean, we dealt with about half of the items in about 10 minutes, and that allowed us to be more deliberative with the other things. We got bogged down a little bit, I thought, in the debate, but by and large, I was happy with where we ended on things. Is there anything particular you'd like me to touch on, or do you want me to just keep talking?
Well, if you could just read the BCO for us, that way we could get the audio version ready. But
Ryan, there's an objective criteria to how great Mel was. So I'm in overtures and I'm trying to speak and do parliamentary procedure and write grounds and do several things. And Mel got me not once, but Bob twice in overtures. He corrected me. So he's replaced Bob. So that's great.
It was a good.
Mel had to rebuke me for not paying attention twice.
Yeah, it was good. I think. I mean, in talking about overtures, I think the things that produce the majority or the committee and the minority reports obviously are probably the most newsworthy. On the one hand, we had the Overture 9, which was a kind of meta-narrative reorganization of AC, which provoked a lot of debate on the committee. Fred brought an amendment to that, which in some ways was kind of the moment. Fred, do you want to talk about that process at all and how that resolved on Overture 9?
Well, one of the items that was of concern with the overture is that would affect permanent committees' ability to speak to their own budgets. And so I brought an amendment that was kind of parallel to that. It was a questionable whether it would be germane or not. The committee deemed that it was germane because there was actually a committee vote to have the permanent committees and agencies directly bring their budgets through their own committee of commissioners to the assembly. And so we spent a lot of time talking about that as well. I do think it's interesting, and maybe this goes back to my previous point about how sort of normal and mundane and progress the assembly was, that one of the most controverted items was the makeup of a permanent committee of the General Assembly. It was not a culture issue per se. It was not, something of the moment. So if that's the most controversial thing we're faced with, we're in a good place.
It was definitely kind of wonk stuff for sure. That germaneness motion was interesting, and I'll mention this for anybody listening to this out in the ether. One thing I've watched everybody on this call do over the years, and Fred particularly with his remarks before GA, his preparation material, David and Howie, as well as this year Jared and Scott, is people have done a great job of communicating what their intent is in terms of motions they want to make and rationale ahead of assembly. And I think that's helped people think through issues in a helpful way. Fred shared a motion that he wanted to make on the floor on Overture 9 the weekend before GA, and it allowed me to kind of think through the germaneness of that motion all weekend. I had some brothers on the committee who really didn't like that, the way I ruled on that. I immediately challenged the committee, challenged the chair if this is wrong. But by having that motion ahead of time, I had about a dozen conversations with folks about germaneness, and that was helpful to me in my work. And Overture 9 created a lot of controversy, and then Overture 12 dealt with the issue of women and non-ordained folks assisting with baptism. And maybe somebody else in the room would want to speak to that. Josh, what did you make of that debate on Overture 12?
Yeah, it was like, as you mentioned, it was one that had a lot of people on both sides of it coming forward to talk about it. And although I think wasn't the main issue more about communion and distributing the elements?
I'm sorry, of course. I said
yeah.
I got sacraments backwards there.
Yeah, with just two sacraments, it's easy sometimes to confuse them. But yeah, and I really felt, and this didn't happen until on the floor of General Assembly, but I felt that the speech from the brother from Mississippi really helped make that point clear to me when he used the illustration of the restaurant and the difference between serving and passing it on. So I thought that was a very helpful conversation, and I think that it was one that the Assembly had and handled very well, and it was handled very well in overtures as well.
I have 3 teenage children, and for the first time, they all got to watch the Thursday overtures debate. And of course, we talked about Zach Bird at the time. But honestly, Zach's creative communication is brilliant. And the way in which he explained administration versus distribution, I think really served the debate and the brothers deliberating well. I also thought it was interesting, sometimes we talk about this in the context of a little country church. I have a lot of little country church in Calvary Presbytery that I love to try to help and make sure they have communion and the things that they need. But this was really not about the little country churches struggling to serve communion. It was more so about the churches that were intentionally doing novelty on this. And I thought we had a good adult Presbyterian discussion on that. And the committee had a point of view, and the Assembly had a point of view. And I'm not sure I agreed with either, but we, the will of the people were heard. And so that was good. The Directory of Worship debate, I was just thrilled with. This is an area that I've been hoping and prayerfully cheerleading for years, that the PCA would be more zealous to have discussions about the Directory for Worship. So the fact that we did a study committee was somewhat miraculous. The fact that we did one on the Directory for Worship was amazing to me. And then, of course, we did another study committee on Christian nationalism, which we kind of ended Assembly with, which was that was good debate. I mean, Fred, you were in there for some of that. How did you think that debate went in the committee?
I thought it went very well. I mean, we didn't really have a lot of intemperate remarks. We didn't have off-topic comments, and you kept us on task. One of the things everyone noticed from Kevin, and it was the same in overtures, one of the best things a moderator or a chairman can do is use humor effectively to disarm heat in the room, move things along. And, Mel was just a master at that. It was just, he had us laughing together and, not at anyone's expense, just making humorous responses. Yeah. And I think that's a really undervalued asset.
Yeah.
Well, if he did do it at anybody's expense, he very humbly did it at his own. And I'm glad you went back to that, because it's like we started to say what a great job Mel did. And then he said, I just think I'll take this to a point where we just talk about the overtures themselves. And that shouldn't happen, because I think people got to see who Mel really was. And he does deserve every bit as much praise for the wonderful way that he did overtures as Kevin does. We were blessed this year. I think we were blessed with a lot of these chairmen that we had on committees. Some of them were younger guys, some of them were older guys, but I think they almost uniformly did terrific work. But I thought the Mel was exceptional and really set a standard for just kindness and like you said, Fred, a gentle sense of humor. And I think people, from all perspectives in the PCA, could see what an effective leader he was. So, Mel, I don't want to embarrass you. I know this is killing you right now, but that needed to be said. So, Fred, thank you for hovering on it.
Well, the checks are in the mail to all of you. I'll make sure my family watches this as part of our family worship tonight.
Well, if there's checks in the mail, I wanted to point out that when you were when you would make a ruling, Mel, at overtures, I think you would usually say, and you would pause to wait for a challenge.
Right.
That you would invite a challenge or make it clear that your feelings aren't going to be hurt if someone wants to disagree. And I thought that was really well done.
Well,
and also to make sure that my check's coming in the mail too. Your handling of overtures on the floor of the assembly was phenomenal. I think that the Christian nationalism overture passed because of your closing speech.
Well,
I think that you did a great job in that. And coming from a presbytery who was one that was asking for that, we had a lot of gratitude and we're very thankful for your work in that. So thank you.
Well, I saw something happen in that, and it's interesting. Derek Radney made this comment in his concluding remarks, and it was actually going to be what I was going to close with, that the same dynamic that happened with the Nashville statement 5 years ago happened, I think, with the nationalism debate, in which it seemed to be the will of the brothers that they wanted to answer this right now with something. And 5 years ago, that was with the Nashville statement. And then they wanted to answer it with more yet to come with the study committee. And that I kind of went into this thinking, I don't know about another study committee, but the debate in the room convinced me. And Josh, you did a good job of advocating for Arizona's overture, and other brothers had some good arguments for that too. And I'm looking forward to, what that committee does. I think the PCA, when we want to, we really do good work. And
Amen.
I'm looking forward to seeing who's on that committee and what they do. That was fun to do that. I had prepared 37 different 5-minute speeches. And when we had gotten to the end of overtures, I realized, 30 of these are 85%, in favor of. And so I realized that I only really needed to engage with a handful of them. And in the case of Overture 12, Randy Thompson, the gentleman from Tuscumbia, who's now honorably retired, who is just a treasure, had done such a good job of arguing for that in the committee. I said, Randy, why don't you argue for that on behalf of the committee? And then in the case of Overture 9, I actually went to several brothers, but I ended up going to EJ, former moderator EJ Nussbaum, who had really argued effectively for what ended up being the majority view on Overture 9. So it was a lot of fun, going back and watching Steve and Fred, and then points of order, Bob, that you and Stephen have done were helpful for me, because it's, there's only about 10 or 11 things that can happen at a GA, and it's really just a matter of the sequence that they happen and how you respond to them. So it was tons of fun to prepare for that. I really enjoyed it, and I'm glad that experience is now in the rearview mirror. So
I think two of the things that struck me the most in that whole thing was your facial expressions were just awesome. I mean, I was up close enough to see them, and you could tell when whoever it was that pulled out a bunch of those things out of the omnibus, and then just time after time got shot down, and finally didn't even show up at the mic. The look on your face was like, it actually says it on Facebook somewhere. This is Mel's look when somebody pulls something from an omnibus and then doesn't speak to it. It was kind of like the.
I was bewildered. I think Scott Swain had a funny little tweet about that, that this was my answer to yes, and this was my answer to no. My sweet little Mary, my 15-year-old daughter, had got my commissioner's book, and she put a little tab by each overture. And what I was thinking when people were pulling those things out is that Mary organized my book, and now I don't know where anything is anymore because all the overtures have been pulled out. But while debate was going on, I kind of went over on the side and I sat down with one of the clerks and I kind of figured out where we were, and it all worked out. So, and then the table, you've got Matt and Ken McCurd and a lot of great men at the table watching everything as well. So I was glad for the experience. Appreciate all of your words. That was great.
And the other thing I was going to say was the times when you had no words, right? You get to the end of the debate, clearly everybody said everything, and moderator asked you anything to say, but nope.
Less is more. Less is
more. Well done.
Well, speaking of words,
2 T's in Mattes, by the way, for the check.
On the subject of words, one little word has been batted about social media now, and that's the word germane, which doesn't have to do with any Teutonic Knights or of that sort. But there's been questions about whether the overture from Tennessee Valley Presbytery, which was amended, instead of having a committee write a pastoral letter, to simply have the assembly use somebody else's letter. Can you speak to how the discussion of germaneness there?
Yeah, that was the second germaneness issue. And I know there's some good brothers online who are really upset about that. We were given Robert's Rules of Order definition. I read it to the committee. We also had an interesting kind of lecture from Howie before overtures in which he expressed a very broad view of germaneness. So much so that Howie thinks you can take a yes and make it a no an overture. And that was somewhat shocking to me, but it was interesting to hear that. Our good friend Sam Duncan is a broad germaneness man as well. What really cinched it for me was John White, beloved Coca-Cola executive, longtime SJC member, ruling elder at Westminster. He was one of several men that I spoke to about some of these issues, and he's a broad germane man too. And so the ruling I made on that was that the intent of the Tennessee Valley overture was for a pastoral letter to be written, and the idea in the committee was, let's just declare this a pastoral letter. And the committee had an opportunity to debate that. There was some vigorous opposition to that. There were some brothers who felt that we had reached too far. But again, I invited the committee to challenge the ruling, and the committee sustained it. I think there was some argumentation against it on the floor. But I think as we get away from this and as we cool down a little bit from the objection, I think the court is going to see that was exactly the way to handle this issue. Ben Glosser, God bless country ARP ministers. I love that
Amen.
guy. He has done the world a really good deed. And I love, and frankly, love the privilege of being able to affirm our NAPART brethren and to stand in solidarity with them against something that we all recognize as a problem. And I think it's going to serve the NAPART family well that the PCA did this. I did speak to your friend, Ryan, who's in Tennessee Valley, and he grumped about us changing his overture, but he signed no objections in front of the hall. So I'll say we survived the challenge to that.
That would have been a challenge.
Well, it's one of those situations, that, somebody can be, frustrated with what happened. And that's fair, especially if it was your overture of your presbytery. But I have not heard anyone, in my opinion, make a plausible argument that it wasn't germane. Right? Once you make your motion in any forum, it's no longer yours. It belongs to the body once it's seconded. And you can't come back later and say, you can vote against it if you don't like it, but you can't come back later and say, this isn't what I wanted. We need to stop this train. That's not how it works. You make your motion, it gets on the floor, and the body can amend it in any way that is germane. And that's all that happened in this instance. And, again, you might not like it, but you vote against it. And overwhelmingly, the assembly was in favor of it. So I think it's kind of a moot, dead issue at this point. So.
And on the other germaneness issue, I really didn't understand the challenge for germaneness. The fact is that anybody in business who builds a budget, they've got a P&O responsibility, profit and loss responsibility, gets a budget for the following year, and they say, this is what it's going to take for me to hit that budget. And those aggregate up to the next level, and that person in charge of that next level has a budget that consists of all of those separate P&Ls, and they go, well, if I add it all up, you all want a lot more than I've got. And so they change the budget. And then when it finally gets before your board for final approval, nobody's getting everything they want, and they knew they weren't going to. But they built what they optimally would like to have, and they argue for it, and that's their prerogative to argue for it. But they are not part of the vetting and decision-making about the appropriateness of the budget. That accrues to the next senior level. Without Fred's amendment, I feel like we were really getting into a troubled area. Not that this problem doesn't need to be addressed, but I didn't understand why this point wasn't just clearly articulated. Nobody who makes a budget gets to vote on their own budget. You made it. You built it, So to me, we're doing it a little bit differently than anybody else I know in the first place. And without the amendment, I think, let me restate that. The amendment itself helped us more appropriately do it. So I thought it was very germane myself.
Indeed. Well, one matter, or several matters that took up a good amount of time, was debating an overture that is recommended to be answered in the negative. And I think I lost a little bit more hair up here as a result of that. And I was trying to be quick to the mic to move the previous question when those matters were before us, because as I understand it, and as I said, I'm the least qualified person on this call, but as I understand it, that if you vote up a recommendation to the negative, it goes back to the presbytery, they can change it, they can send it back up next year, they can fix it. And if you vote it down, it goes back to next year's overtures committee, unchanged, with none of the feedback, none of the recommended changes. The exact same thing just comes back next year. So can someone help me understand better what happens when something is recommended in the negative?
I think, Ryan, it's a matter of folks not really understanding what we're doing with the overtures report. So as many PCA folks will know, if you're a member of the overtures committee, you can't debate during the overtures report. Now, a few years back, I challenged the notion that meant you couldn't make points of order, and I lost. So I spent Thursday trying not to twitch as I'm sitting there and I can't say a word, and we're wasting time, and we're doing this with people making motions they can't make. Like the fifth time someone came up to make a substitute and Kevin said, you can't do that, I was ready to be committed. And so, the thing is, I don't understand. So here's the thing. If there's you could make a motion to recommit. And so if you really don't like a recommendation in the negative, that's what you should do right from the get-go, rather than trying to argue against the overture and get in a back door so everyone knows what you want. And then if it doesn't pass, there's no sense talking anymore, because it's not, what's going to happen. So if there's one piece of advice I have for future commissioners, it's if you don't like an overture recommendation in the negative, stand up and make a motion to recommit. The debate will be much more focused, because it won't be about the overture itself. It'll be whether it should go back again. And if that fails, then we can dispose of it in 30 seconds. But these lengthy, this is right up there with my other favorite time waster is you have a substitute to and a minority report. And if the minority report, whether it passes or fails, that's how you know the main motion is going to go. And brothers feel like they got to debate 20 more minutes when we've just taken a vote and we know how the next vote's going to go, especially if it's not close. Mm-hmm. Yeah. We're just wasting time. I'm not saying it's not valuable to talk about things, but there are a lot of things we got to talk about. And so you're really robbing from Peter to pay Paul. It's not like you're just trying to rush out the door. There's a lot of things that we need to debate, and you're taking time away from other substantive issues.
Yeah. Fred, I would also say that something extraordinary happened this year during those debates. If you go back and you rewatch that sequence in the afternoon, it seemed obvious to me that a number of the brothers coming up to the microphones thought that recommittal accrued to the presbytery. And I was like, when is that going to get corrected? And it never did. And it seemed like it got worse and worse. And I was like, what are we doing here? It had me actually second guessing myself after getting very clear instructions from you prior to my opportunity to do it. Up, down, recommit. Up, down, send overtures back into session. And that didn't seem to be very clear to the people, the brothers going to the microphone. So, yeah, we need to do a better job somehow.
And that's why I brought up, I tried to cut off some of that when they wanted to postpone indefinitely something we were voting in the negative. What are you doing, for crying out? That's not even what that motion's used for. And I think Kevin by that point was pretty frustrated, and he just kind of blew it off. But I was just trying to say, let's just stop and vote, for crying out loud, because you're getting nowhere. You're making differences with no distinction.
And I don't want to rob anyone of his constitutional right to express his opinion on an overture, but I think brothers need to consider, will this speech actually have any reasonable impact on what we are doing this year? Nominating committee, several disruptions. I don't know, Mel, you're something of a historian of the PCA. Have we ever had 9 floor nominees?
Yeah, I went back. I don't think we've had that many in the last 25 years, but if you go way back, the floor nominees used to be a regular feature of General Assemblies. So while it was new to some, it's part of the practice of the church, and it's a legitimate thing to do. And it certainly was entertaining this year, for sure.
Yeah. Well, it was just a long series of votes. I don't know how entertaining that was. But.
Well, when they're trying to reconsider your election, you might find that entertaining.
Yeah, it was entertaining to me, and I lost. So,
that was, now there was another thing that seemed to take a lot of time was the review of presbytery records, but that committee was deferred to more than, what was it, a 98% deferral rate? There was one recommendation that went down, and then one thing added.
I have a thesis about RPR that I'm going to try out on the call here. So I administrate a medium-sized PCA church, and over the years I have found that it's actually harder to spend between $500 and $5,000 than it is to spend $50,000 to $500,000, because there's a certain kind of problem, let's call it a tendency rather than a problem, that everyone feels informed enough to speak into. And so if the youth director is out there spending $1,700 on some crazy thing, everybody is going to speak about that. But there's a sense in which RPR is, we're kind of, in a loving PCA way, policing our bad tendencies. And everybody had to weigh in on that. And it took longer than it needed. And you've already pointed out that by and large, the assembly sustained the work of the committee, which most of the time the assembly does anyway. Nevertheless, one of my big takes, Ryan, on this year's GA is when you have more than 2,000 PCA presbyters in the room, because we're a grassroots denomination, there's always going to be a small d democratic impulse for people to weigh in on things that are administrative in nature in a way they might not weigh in on a legislative or a judicial item. And RPR for some people is kind of shocking, because you find out in another presbytery they have a radically different way of approaching that, and then you sort of have to go through the spin cycle of working through that. By and large, I thought RPR landed the bird pretty effectively. It just took a long time to get there.
Well, Steve did a great job. And I think that's evidenced by the result.
Yeah.
And, Ryan, this is one of these things, everybody has their own tendency. Mel can explain stuff like this in a very folksy and effective way. Right after the RPR report, Howie and I huddled up, how can we change the RAO to stop that from happening again? and the thing about it that I didn't like was men kept pulling out initial citations. Mm-hmm. There's no sense in pulling out an initial citation. My presbytery got cited on some things that I don't agree with that RPR cited them. We're going to answer the citation. Yeah. And then if RPR still insists they're right, then I'll answer it on the floor. But the tendency that we don't like that you even asked us a question, so we're going to waste 2,000 guys' time is ridiculous. We should have only talked about the actual unsatisfactory answers, the ones where there was really something at stake. And then we could have spent more time on those items again. You've got a finite amount of time, so you want to spend more time on the important things and less time on the less important things. So that's something that really, it kind of got me. You know, Kevin repeated a line that I've said many times. You guys have probably said it too. The thing about RPR is it's the wild, wild west. It's like the old rules 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Most people now don't realize that our debates used to be much more free flowing. You could amend from the floor. You could substitute from the floor. You could do almost anything from the floor. And we realized that was going to start making GA take 3 weeks long. And so we pushed a lot of that to the committees. We didn't in the case of RPR. And that's why that report, how long was it, Steve? 3.5 hours?
Yeah, like 200 pages in about 3.5 hours. So, yeah, and there's been a lot of discussion, even on the committee level, of some of the things that we could do either to shorten the report. I mean, there was discussion last year, although it didn't get very far, basically saying initial citations just go to the presbyteries and the assembly doesn't even see them. Mainly just, I mean, that would cut the report by probably 2/3 just right there. And then all you're really dealing with are unsatisfactory responses even from the next year. The problem, I mean, again, the whole idea is that makes the committee a quasi-commission in the sense that they're not making recommendations anymore. They're just sending down citations. But I also think that, there were some good discussions. The issue of whether or not, you can say your moderator becomes a commission, a one-man commission to appoint people. I mean, I think that was a good conversation overall. But also to Fred's point, I mean, you had a guy who tried to basically remove a response from the previous year. He wasn't trying to make it satisfactory. He wanted just to strike the whole thing. It's like, well, we can't do that. We could do something else. But I think there's a lot of just misunderstanding about what it is and what it does, and even misunderstanding of what the committee is trying to do, and that we're somehow the police force to go look into to do all these investigating, and then we're the ones. I mean, obviously the citations arise from RPR because we're the ones who read the minutes, but we're just making recommendations to the assembly. And even although again this year there was only one item that was pulled out, even in years past, I mean, if the assembly, I get frustrated when the assembly removes a exception of substance based on bad information. That frustrates me. But if the information is correct and the debate is good and the assembly says, no, we don't think that's important, it doesn't bother me. It's up to, that's the whole point of the committee, is to make recommendations to the assembly. But it is that sort of this assumption that RPR is doing something beyond its brief, outside of its scope. And I don't see us doing that ever, really. I mean, so.
No, I think Fred read my Facebook post, because that's pretty much what I said on Facebook, because there's people having all this discussion, and I say, hey, you don't need 2,000 people to listen to every complaint that you have, right? Because it doesn't mean anything until it comes back and you answer it, right? You just get yanked and you don't have to answer it. I don't need to hear that, call. Anyway, so they said, well, it's our right. I said, yeah, it is your right. You're absolutely right. But you're going to spend 3 hours wasting an entire 2,000, well, by that point, it's probably 1,500 or less people's time.
It's a problem of nomenclature, I think. We need to change it from an exception of substance to an inter-court dialogue. So just inter-court interrogatory or something like that, so that doesn't sound like an exception, which is odd because the guys that seem to oppose the exceptions of substance are also the guys who like to get exceptions to the standards. But that's a
Ryan, that's
subject
an awfully feminist or feminine kind of description there. We need something a little more manly than that.
Touche.
Yeah, and that's the other point I made. I think that you're just saying. That's the point I made on the Facebook discussion, is that we're not talking about trivial things here. We're talking about people who are literally violating the Constitution of the PCA, or appear to be doing that. They have a chance to answer to say, no, we really weren't. But you know as well as I do, 9.5 times out of 10, they certainly were. And they just want to change the Constitution without changing the Constitution. They just want to buy to say, oh, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Ryan, right before I got on the call with y'all, I was on a Presbytery Administration Committee, and we were working through the first reading of the minutes of our spring meeting. And we were talking about our minutes in light of this RPR report. So in some ways, I think it's helpful to the poor clerks out there who have to try to make sense of everything to get on the same page with the GA, because, you know, we became aware of what could be citable, you know, a citable issue with the way we handle last minute nominations to assembly if somebody can't make it. You know, we had a good conversation about what do we need to do different so we won't get dinged by RPR on that. But I like the language of what Bob and Fred said about maybe there is a way to not litigate the first offense citation. That's an interesting way of handling it, I think.
Yeah, and I wonder about not letting RPR people speak on the floor either, that you either come up with a minority report so we have your arguments, we know what we're talking about, or you just let the two courts talk, let Presbyterian General Assembly talk for a little bit.
Well, so real quick, I mean, just so we don't lose that one. So for instance, there was one individual who was on the committee who had 8 things he wanted to bring up. And he said, I'm not going to bring minority reports, which each one would take an hour, because I can make an amendment on the floor. So at least be aware of that. Now, perhaps we could also drastically reduce the amount of time that RPR spends on minority reports in the first place, or allow them to be grouped together. So if there's 8 presbyteries that have the same exception of substance, they could all be addressed as one rather than need 8 individual ones. But if you wanted to go down that road, I think having men from the committee speak to issues is important. I don't think they should be able to make motions, perhaps, if you want to go that direction. But sometimes they're the ones who read the minutes. Like, I didn't read all 87 sets of minutes. So as the committee chair, I don't have all of that information at my fingertips. In fact, somebody asked me to go find the minutes. I'm like, yeah, I'm not doing that. Sorry. No way. But on some of the ones that I knew there were issues that were going to arise, I did have those minutes available. But I didn't have the minutes of whatever presbytery that somebody had some small issue with or whatever. So I think there's some ways to think through how that's done. I would also encourage, this is my plug, send people to RPR. If you can, send your clerk to RPR. Like, don't send some other guy. We don't do that in our presbytery, but I think if you can send your clerk at least once in his life to go to RPR and have to read other people's minutes and go through that discussion would be really helpful for the assembly and for your presbytery. So.
Well, as we wrap up, thinking about how the PCA has changed, it was 2019 that Kevin DeYoung reintroduced us to the term concupiscence. How have we changed in the, 6 years?
Well, I go back to what I said in the very beginning, that I think that issue that brought that up woke a lot of, especially ruling elders up, and probably some of the younger teaching elders as well, to say, where is the PCA going? We lost churches over that. I lost some good friends, not and lose them as friends, but I lost their presence in the PCA. I think that was a real turning point. People saw how far things had gone, to use a temperate word. And so they're standing up saying, we can't let this happen. And we're trying to make the point that the people that defended that are still here. They didn't go away. The source of the problem at that point went away, but the people that supported them are still here. And so they're not going away. So we need to stay vigilant. And I think it was a turning point, and especially for ruling elders, to say, what are you guys doing up there?
I think, Ryan, one of the things I've seen, I've been in the PCA now almost 30 years, is we have now a much greater commitment to the church. So I'm optimistic that it's not just, we had a pretty boring assembly this year, and we had an almost record attendance. So it's not like everybody came because they felt they had to vote on a certain issue. And I have been incredibly pleased and blessed to see a younger group of both teaching and ruling elders take an interest in church government, in our higher courts, and in polity. I mean, I was a former lawyer who was a polity nerd 30 years ago, and I was an anomaly. Most of our polity guys are younger than me now, who really take an interest, in this stuff.
There's a whole
And they're not just
podcast
teaching
dedicated
elders;
to
they're
that.
ruling elders too.
Well, anything else that we missed? Talking about any encouragements, discouragements, or expectations for next year in Louisville?
I'll give you a closing comment. Zach Bird was mentioned earlier by Mel. One of the things that's easy to miss with that guy is that everybody remembers the one-liner, but he generally speaks for 5 minutes. What he's saying is good and accurate and accessible to people. He's a powerful talent in the PCA. That's why I wanted him to convene a committee, which it was MTW. It was a big committee. And Lloyd Kim actually texted me and said what a great job he did, which I was very appreciative of. We have other men. I thought Jackson Lynn, I don't know where he came from, but I love the way that he put together his argument. And it takes a lot of courage, when you're new to that process. And I think I first saw Tim Cox on maybe Polity Matters, or maybe it was your podcast, Ryan. Men who are willing to stand up against what the common narrative is and let everybody hear the other side of a specific story. It's not just that they're new young leaders, and I could spend another hour naming young men with varying perspectives that I have a lot of respect for, but they are young men, and reinforcing that point, I love seeing them step up, overcome their recriminations about how they're going to look or anything else, and operate by their conscience to do what they think the Lord has called them to do. And I got to tell you, I couldn't be more impressed. And like Fred, it makes me ultra optimistic. I turned 70 in a couple of months here. I know that this will be my last go in the SJC, because even if I still had all my marbles, I want to get out of the way. I want these men running things because I have confidence that God's raised up leaders that will be better for us in the future, that will keep this church strong. So I wanted to throw that out. And again, I could give you, another entire podcast of the men who spoke, who are speaking online, Jared and Ben and all of those guys. They're terrific. And we do have a lot of young leaders that are coming up, and a lot of them spoke at this assembly. It made me very happy.
And I think a lot of those young guys were encouraged by your sermon, Steve, not to be moderates, but to be zealous for the Church of the Lord Jesus Christ. So thank you for that.
Well, I'd praise God if that were true, brother, because I meant every word of that. I that passion is what will sustain us. Love the Lord first, love him hard, and then love his church. And I think we're in good shape. So I agree with Fred.
Well said. Well, thank you all for your time today. This was fun.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks for having us.
Great to see you, brothers. And Bob, I apologize for trying to gang up on you. We love you.
And for Philly, I didn't even notice.
See ya.
Thanks for joining the conversation on the Westminster Standard, which is the podcast of Jude 3. I'm Ryan Beasy, and want to remind you that the opinions and views on this podcast are not necessarily those of Jude 3. If you have a concern about something that someone has said on this program, you're welcome to take it up with that individual. Also, want to thank those of you who have joined with us at Jude 3 and the PCA for with financial support. We depend on your donations and generosity to continue our work. You can visit our website, jude3pca.org, to browse our archives and library of resources aimed at promoting confessional renewal and fidelity within the Presbyterian Church in America. We're on a more relaxed distribution schedule this summer. You can look for some interesting and noteworthy conversations coming out in July and August. And I look forward to talking with you then.